This episode of Lunduke Show is brought to you in part by System 76, Pogo Linux, and Lulzbot, and viewers like you, viewers like these. I just want to take a moment to point out that if you go over to System 76 right now, the sales they've got going on are absolutely fantastic. Tons of their laptops, tons of their desktops, including the Wild Dog Pro, which I use here to produce everything that happens with the Lunduke Show, are all on sale right now, along with their Galago Pro, which is an absolutely fantastic laptop. Highly, highly recommend those beasts. If you need a Linux running machine, that's the place to find them. You can get them over at system76.com. I don't know exactly how long that sale is going on for, but, don't mess around. Don't wait for that. And if you go over to lulzbot.com, they got something similar going on right now. They've got their Black Friday, Cyber Monday deal going on, and they've got 20% off of their 3D printers, which you can look at that bad boy right there. That right there is a Lulzbot Mini, and I love it to pieces. And they've got that right now for $250 off the normal price. Tool heads and filaments and all sorts of good, delicious, wonderful 3D printing smorgasbords are available over at lulzbot.com. Today, we're going to talk about something that is going to assuredly get me some mail. We're going to talk about net neutrality. A lot's happening in the net neutrality world right now, and I want to walk through a couple of key points of it because people are freaking out about net neutrality and the lack, potentially, of net neutrality. I'm about to take a series of stances that are probably going to be not terribly popular with anybody, but I'm going to go ahead and take them anyway. I should point out right off the bat that the stances I'm going to take in this episode are not the official stances, or might not be, I don't know, I haven't actually checked with them, of any of the sponsors of this show, any of the Patreon supporters that support this show and make it possible. This is just me talking about what I'm seeing in as factual a way as I can and presenting my opinion to all of you after that. Simple, straightforward. So let's dive into it because things are crazy in the net neutrality world. I call this video Net Neutrality No Big Deal because I really don't think it's that big of a deal. But what is it? What is net neutrality? I mean, there's a ton of excitement, apprehension, angst, freaking outiness happening around net neutrality right now, and that's not anything new. People have been freaking out about things related to net neutrality for the last couple years, the last 2 years especially. But what is it? Well, in a nutshell, net neutrality is the idea that all of the traffic on the internet must be treated the same. So if you've got packets flying through the internet, it can't be treated differently than someone else's packets that may go to or come from a different destination. As an example, if you want to stream some Netflix, and you're on an AT&T network, and AT&T also has a on-demand streaming thing, AT&T then can't throttle your bandwidth coming from Netflix to make your Netflix watching experience worse. So that's really what it comes down to, is throttling. And I'm not a fan of throttling. I don't know anyone on planet Earth who thinks throttling is a fantastic idea, other than a very select few people who could stand to potentially make money because of throttling bandwidth to and from specific websites and domains. Now, net neutrality hasn't really been around all that long as a real thing. In fact, until 2015, closer to the end of 2015, in fact, there was no net neutrality laws, rules, regulations that were in place and enforced. There just wasn't. Now, many of you might remember 2015, 2014, 2013. You were using the internet. I was using the internet. There were no net neutrality rules in place at that time. So this is actually a fairly new concept. The idea that you shouldn't model and throttle the data going through any given points is not a new concept, but net neutrality as a push for law is actually a fairly new concept. Now, back in those olden days, there were some issues. Comcast, Verizon, and AT&T, and this is all pre-2015, were all caught throttling some of the bandwidth going to and from specific websites and services. I believe AT&T had a thing where they were throttling bandwidth going to Apple's FaceTime unless you used their service or signed up for like one of their FaceTime services, something like that. And Comcast and Verizon did similar things. I might have that backwards. It might have been Verizon that did that. Anyway, there were some throttling issues that came around. In all those cases, the companies either got sued or negotiated with or caved under public pressure to stop doing that because nobody liked it, right? So that's kind of how we handled net neutrality before there was a net neutrality law. Overall, pre-2015, things worked on the internet. Right? We streamed video. Things got better with streaming video, not necessarily because of the net neutrality law, but more because the technology and the servers and the bandwidth, all of that got much, much better. The power of the machines we got, the operating systems, everything kind of improved with the goal of making that experience better, of streaming video and audio and that sort of thing. It just got better and better over the years. But that was happening before 2015 too. So I don't know that we can really say that net neutrality rules and regulations that may have come into play around the end of 2015 really made that substantial of a difference for most of us. It may have impacted many people that might have been throttled under one ISP or another for specific sites. But overall, pre-2015, things worked. It wasn't perfect. Like I said, Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, and several other ISPs were caught doing throttling, and that sucked. That sucked a lot, and man, did they get flack for it. It was all over the internet. People were pissed at those companies for doing that, and they lost customers because of that, who jumped ship over to other ISPs who literally advertised that they weren't throttling you. which makes a ton of sense. It became a really big business thing to not throttle people. So here we are in 2017. We're nearing the end of 2017 right now. In fact, tomorrow is Thanksgiving Day here in the United States. And the current chair of the FCC has proposed rolling back those 2015 rules and kind of putting in some modifications to it. People are freaked. People are truly freaked out about it. If you go on any social media network, like if you look at Twitter and you see the things that are trending there, people are losing their minds over net neutrality. They are upset at the FCC and the new FCC chair, Ajit Pai, for pushing this sort of thing. They're upset at the president for being the president while this is going on. They're upset at the companies who are pushing for no net neutrality rules to be in effect. People are upset. And I kind of understand why people are upset, but I thought, let's take a moment. Let's take a step back and let's walk through exactly what the new FCC chair says is the stance of him and the FCC going forward, so we can really reasonably approach this reasonably. I think I said reasonably a few too many times, but it is a reasonable way to go. So I'm going to read a series of statements from the current FCC chair, and then we're going to keep talking about a few things here. All right. Here we go. Net neutrality is the basic principle of a free and open. Everything I'm going to say for a little while is all his words, by the way. Net neutrality is the basic principle of a free and open internet. It means an online world in which consumers can access the lawful content of their choice, and that there aren't any gatekeepers deciding what points of the internet they can or can't access. It's reasonable. I believe strongly in a free and open internet, not just as a regulator, but as a consumer. And if you look at how the internet has developed over the last 20 years, I think part of the reason why we have the digital economy that's the envy of the world is precisely because we have a free and open internet that's the benefit of everybody in the internet ecosystem. First and foremost, we want to make sure that all content that is lawful on the internet can be accessed by consumers. That's a bedrock protection of the open internet that I think everybody would agree with. Let me come back to that because that's an interesting point. But secondly, we want to make sure that we have the ability to allow all kinds of streaming companies, others who create content on the internet, to be able to reach their endpoints, which is the consumer. It's kind of hard to disagree with any of that so far. And so we can envision some pro-competitive arrangements that allow for video, in particular, to be delivered in an efficient way. And one could conceive that anti-competitive arrangements. And the simple point I've made is that we can't predict in advance every single potential type of outcome. Some might be good, some might be bad. And on a case-by-case basis, let's figure out what types of conduct are anti-competitive or otherwise would harm consumers or innovators, and take action if we see something like that arise. Again, pretty straightforward. Taking action against companies engaging in monopolistic and anti-competitive behaviors is something we don't tolerate. I mean, we fought against Microsoft doing that, many years back, and these are just things that we handle on a case-by-case basis. That's pretty normal. If you act before the fact, I'm going to continue quoting him here, then you're preemptively saying that we think the marketplace is forever going to be the same, and we can take account of every particular kind of conduct and say that, you know what? It should be unlawful. And if the agency is going to do that, it has to recognize that there are severe potential unintended consequences. First, you could be prohibiting a number of pro-competitive business arrangements. And secondly, you could end up reducing investments. Companies might start to look elsewhere to invest if they think that the regulatory framework is too prescriptive. After the fact regulation, which allows you to take action, again, based on actual harms that have been demonstrated in the record, is a much better way, on balance, to protect consumers, as opposed to preemptive regulation, which might seem appealing at first, but which has serious long-term consequences. And just to take an aside here before we kind of finish out the quote from the FCC chairman, what it seems like he's saying to me here is basically the difference between big government and little government, right? Or government regulation of something heavy before preemptive government regulation, as opposed to after the fact regulation. So letting the free market decide versus regulating a market before the free market can decide. And that's a sort of debate that people have been having for friggin' ever. But right now it's colliding with the internet and how we model traffic on the internet, which is kind of interesting. And I continue. And the economic literature is pretty rich on this, that preemptive regulation is appropriate when there's a major market failure, when the internet is broken. And the point I've simply made is that if you look at the internet that we had in 2015, we were not living in some digital dystopia. There was nothing broken about the marketplace in such a fundamental way that these Title II regulations were appropriate. And Title II regulations refers to how the net neutrality rules in 2015 were put together, basically making treating the internet as similar to what you would with the telecom industry. Concluding what his statements is here. In the internet age, consumers are able to complain to the Federal Trade Commission authorities, the Justice Department, the FCC, other state agencies as well. And secondly, these agencies on their own have the ability to initiate investigations. I continue to think that there's a very robust set of legal protections, both with respect to competition and consumer protection on the federal and state levels, that will continue to provide relief to consumers. I think that antitrust and consumer protection authorities stand at the vanguard to make sure that consumers and competition are protected. So that's the statement from the chairman of the FCC. And I feel it's important to have that in our minds, to think about really what's the stance here. Because if you just simply look around the internet, what you see is a lot of vilification of people who don't completely support having net neutrality rules, regulations, and laws in place at the federal government level within the United States. And I think that's a little bit problematic, because a lot of times the vilification doesn't tend to be really based on anything necessarily all that real. And so sometimes it is. I know I'm going to upset a lot of people by saying some of these things. You know what? Let me continue. Let me continue here. Let's take a step back from the statements from the FCC, and let's look at this from another direction. Three of the biggest companies that are supporting net neutrality currently are Google, Netflix, and Microsoft. As it would happen, Google, Netflix, and Microsoft are also three of the biggest advocates for DRM being a standard across the web. Why is that important? Well, think about this. If you take away net neutrality, a lack of net neutrality rules would not by itself mean you lose access to any sites or content. It simply means that there's less regulations in place at the federal level to require your ability to get to that content in a non-throttled way. DRM, on the other hand, is specifically meant to restrict your access to sites and content. Think about this for a minute. Let's go ahead and put this back up here. Google, Netflix, and Microsoft support both net neutrality and DRM. Think about that for a minute. Google, Netflix, and Microsoft, by not only supporting DRM, they actually wrote the specification for encrypted media extensions at the W3C, which helps to make DRM standardized across the whole of the web. They have put significant resources into making sure that people, you, me, and other people, do not have access to content at all. No access to content unless we pay them significant amounts of money or adhere to other requirements that they set forth. And yet they support net neutrality. Something feels amiss? Something does feel amiss. Let's continue here. This isn't about free speech. This isn't about censorship or internet access. This is about money. And that is all this is about. If you see people posting on Twitter or anywhere else talking about how this is the FCC's current actions to remove the recently added net neutrality laws are an attempt to censor or an attempt to limit free speech or limit people's access to internet and content, that's blatantly false. I'm not going to say those people are lying, because I truly don't believe they are. I think the people who are pushing that narrative simply don't understand what's happening here. And I'm going to get so much angry email about this. But here's the deal. This is, let me see, do I have this all here? Here we are. Companies that would financially benefit from selective bandwidth throttling don't like net neutrality. Right? So if a company is both an ISP and has a streaming video service that might compete with Google, Amazon, Netflix, etc., and they might benefit in some way by reducing the bandwidth available to go to Netflix, let's say, and goes instead to their service, that makes their service look faster, more responsive, that encourages people to use their service over, say, Netflix or something else. There might be a financial incentive there for them to not like net neutrality. And that's exactly what you see happening. However, companies that would not benefit from that throttling, companies that aren't both an ISP and a content provider, that have no conflict of interest there, they like net neutrality because from a monetary standpoint, if there is no net neutrality, there's the potential for the system to be abused in such a way that the bandwidth going to their sites becomes throttled, which might hurt their pocketbook. With net neutrality laws in place, that might help their pocketbook because, well, there won't be any throttling. There definitely won't be. Not saying there will be if there's no net neutrality rules, but if there is net neutrality rules, there won't be. So that is a financial benefit. Let me think here. Now, okay, so monetarily, there's just so much going on here. It makes my brain explode, and I'm also trying to find ways to word all of this so that I don't piss off too many people. Let's just keep going. If you are upset about the net neutrality rules being changed, but not about the DRM being used across the internet, then you're not worried about censorship or access, right? That is just a flat out reasonable statement. If you hear representatives from Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Netflix coming out talking about the horrors of net neutrality because of equal access to the internet or censorship or free speech, anything like that, that's bull malarkey. Those companies are actively engaged in not only defining and utilizing, but heavily promoting the complete encryption, and not in the good, let's keep things secure in the internet way, but in the you can't have access unless you pay them digital extortion money way. They're big on pushing DRM. That means that they literally are pushing a lack of access. They want you to have less access unless you give them money in the amount that they define, right? It's frustrating. When you really sit down and think about it, you see a lot of big companies that are playing to their monetary interest. And that muddies everything up. That makes the water really friggin' murky. So what do I think? Trying to put everything aside. Trying to put aside the highly inflammatory statements that many have made, including people that I highly respect. In fact, the EFF has made many statements on net neutrality. Huge amount of respect for the EFF. My respect for the EFF is off the charts. But their statements around net neutrality have been highly inflammatory, and I don't feel have been terribly accurate compared to what they should have been. So, everything pushed aside. Statements from individuals, organizations, companies. What do I think here? I think the idea behind net neutrality is inherently good. However, there is a downside to the federal government imposing net neutrality, and that is that it makes the government more involved with the internet than I'm comfortable with. Think about it from this point of view. Net neutrality maybe stays the same or gets increased, something along those lines, right? The FCC says, you know what? Yeah, let's keep going. Federal net neutrality laws in place. How do you enforce that? How do you watch that? How do you pay attention to that? Well, as you go along, you're basically giving the federal government more authority to both surveil and monitor internet traffic, which probably should make everybody nervous. As well as impose penalties upon companies for real or perceived throttling. That should make people very, very nervous. I like no throttling. No one likes throttling. We just read a bunch of statements from the FCC chairman. He was on board too. He's like, yeah, he does not want a bunch of throttling going on. He just doesn't want that to happen. But on the same token, federalizing the monitoring of how traffic flows through the internet, that's kind of scary. Do we really want that in place? As nerds, as just some nerdy people, push politics aside. Just completely aside. I don't care what presidents you like or don't like, what politicians you like or don't like, whether you're left, right, up, down, turning counterclockwise. I don't care. Politics totally aside. Do you want the federal government regulating and controlling the way that information flows through the internet? I personally don't. I can see a valid argument for why someone would want that. I totally can. And that's a reasonable argument and discussion to have. And that hopefully would be the place that we could get to with this discussion, but is a place that we never can because everyone's so busy freaking the heck out about net neutrality and just losing their collective minds about it. We actually haven't had a reasonable discussion around this, about how involved we want the federal government in the flow of data through the internet. How much do we want them monitoring it? Well, which I would assume the EFF and other organizations who have spoken out on the goodness of net neutrality and the evils of the current FCC wouldn't want the federal government doing additional, basically snooping and spying on the internet, right? We don't want the federal government doing that. It seems to me like many organizations who are pro net neutrality are either doing so for monetary reasons or doing so against their own interests for privacy, security, and federal oversight over the industry. That's my personal feeling on that matter. In my opinion, DRM being a standardized thing across the web is a far bigger threat to free speech and the spread of information than a lack of net neutrality laws. To be clear, again, we went through almost the entire history of the internet with no net neutrality rules and regulations whatsoever. None. There was none. I mean, we didn't even come up with the phrase net neutrality until fairly recently in the life of the internet. So this is new. DRM, on the other hand, well, DRM is standardized. Essentially, the EME, the encrypted media extensions, is standardized now. The W3C standardized it. All major web browsers have implemented it. DRM is there in your internet experience, whether you want it or not. And it is right now limiting what you can and can't read, watch, listen to, etc., and access right now. It is literally limiting your ability to access information, content, entertainment, communications right now. Lack of net neutrality laws is doing nothing of the sort. If net neutrality remains in effect, which it is right now, I'm fine with that. I really am. If it becomes not in effect anymore and is replaced by a new series of rules from the FCC, I'm probably okay with that. I think there's pluses and minuses there. I really do. There's some upsides and there's some downsides, and I'm probably going to complain rather loudly about the downsides no matter what. But realistically, none of those downsides, not one, is even close to approaching the amount of damage and destruction that DRM as a standard across the web does right now. Right now. If half the effort to push net neutrality, to enforce net neutrality, to fight against the getting rid of net neutrality that's going on right now, the freaking out went into fighting against DRM, the world would be a much better place. Could you imagine that? I mean, we're not a big fan of DRM, right? If you're a nerd, you're probably like, yeah, DRM kind of sucks. I mean, just as a general rule, there's only a couple of you out there that are like, yeah, go DRM. There's really only a handful of you. Could you, and when the encrypted media extension standard, which is really the W3C blessed World Wide Web standard for creating DRM in browsers, became a thing. People freaked out. I freaked out. A lot of people were upset about it online, and there was some online protesting. Nowhere near what we're seeing with net neutrality. Nowhere near. Why? Well, all those people who stand to gain financially by having net neutrality laws in place, they stand to gain financially by having DRM in place and standardized. It's money. This is all money, and it's people are you and me are being manipulated by people with tons and tons and tons of money to try and get us to make sure we fight for the laws that will help their business more than other businesses, not that are in our best interests. We can have a debate, you and me, about whether or not the federal government should handle the regulation of how data flows through the internet, which is what we're talking about here with net neutrality. We can have that discussion. And I think that's a reasonable discussion to have. Should that be federalized? Should that be at the state level? Should it be at the county level? Should it be just wild, wild west and people do whatever? I think there's many legitimate arguments to be made on all sides of that debate. However, we're not having that debate right now because the big people with the big pocketbooks who have been pushing DRM down our throats for the last several years are getting involved and telling us that we need to freak out with infographics about how the FCC is going to steal our babies and take away our freedom of speech. And that's not helpful. That's not helpful at all. Again, I like an open internet. That's what I want. It doesn't help me any to close down the internet, to throttle the internet, to DRM protect the internet. None of that helps me whatsoever. It doesn't make my life better at all. It's all a matter of how do we do that. And the companies who are coming out and saying, we want net neutrality and DRM, well, they're not being honest with us. Not even a little bit. And they know it. They're actively manipulating us and actively manipulating the laws to benefit them, regardless of what it does to us. And that's absolutely, absolutely uncool. That's my thought around this. I recognize that many people will take issue with some of the things I just said. And that's totally okay. It really and truly is. I think these are debates that are worth having, are truly worth having, but we're not having them right now. So as you go, right now is the day before Thanksgiving in the States, and over the coming days and weeks, there's going to be a lot more freak out about net neutrality. Have these discussions with people who are freaking out. Whether you share this video with them or just talk to them about some of these key things. Ask people if someone really thinks that removing the net neutrality laws will hurt their free speech. Well, ask them, did they have free speech on the internet in 2014? If they can't come back and they don't have a good concrete example of how they weren't able to go on the internet and talk to people in 2014, then they're not right about that. This is a big deal. Ask people if they're freaking out about net neutrality, if they freak out in equal measure or more about DRM being a standard across the web. Because if the answer is no, if they're not, then they're not really that upset about net neutrality. They're probably just glomming onto something to make a big deal about. And me saying that's going to piss off even more people. I would like to reiterate right now that none of my sponsors or the Patreon supporters of this show have anything to do with my opinions on this. I just simply want to have an honest discussion about the merits of net neutrality type regulations and where they should exist, if at all. And I think those are reasonable discussions to have, and it annoys the dickens out of me that we just can't have them. And that's kind of crummy. Before we head off into the sunset, seriously, look at these printers. Oh my gosh. And look at these sales. Oh my gosh. There's so much good stuff going on. And if you haven't yet, seriously, my sponsors of the show are amazing. Go over to pogolinux.com, click on their servers, and just scroll through and marvel at the glory. I mean, look at the amount of RAM that you can fit in some of these 1U units. 2U ARM-based rack mount unit that has 24 2.5-inch drive bays on it. Oh my lordy. Ooh, I'm a pretty big fan also. Wait, do I have this one here? Where is it at? Now, where is it at? Man, seriously, there we go. The Iris 418-36, a 4U unit that can take 768 gigs of RAM. Okay. 36 3.5-inch drive bays. That's cool. But what about this 4U unit down here that takes 60 drive bays? Holy friggin' moly. I love my sponsors. I have the coolest sponsors in the world. It's all sorts of different types of nerdy hardware, freedom-loving, open-source-loving companies who don't necessarily agree with the words that are coming out of Brian Lunduke's mouth, but they support me anyway because they love the freedoms. Oh, everybody, go forth. Have amazing conversations with people about net neutrality and try not to get all freaky outy about it.